just push the record button. There we go. All right. Here's something just a nice metaphor for SRV. It is like an iceberg. So the little bit of reading you've done in Wolfensberger's book itself, and some of the other kind of ancillary pieces that you've been exposed to, like you have kind of a bit of it. And it is an elegantly, like if this was a scientific a hard science theory, it would be called an elegant theory. And what is meant by that is an elegant theory is one that has a very simple premise, but from it come like so many important corollaries, important avenues that can be opened up from there, that the more you study these ideas, the richer it gets and the more helpful it is to you. So I think we're going to uncover this iceberg little by little over the next couple weeks. So, I mean, you know this, SRV, these are not new ideas, right? I mean, these are ideas that have been around for a while. Many of you in your papers talked about the shift from normalization, the predecessor theory, to social role valorization, but the primary advocate and developer of social role valorization, you know, was Wolfensberger. And he, just an amazing guy, right? So in the 60s, he was working as a psychologist at Beatrice, which was a huge institution in the state of Nebraska. And at that time, like the conditions in the institution were pretty well known. Like the Pennhurst expose had been done, Stuff for the Children had come out, Burton Blatt's expose, Christmas in Purgatory, you know, with these images, like people knew what was happening and everybody knew it was wrong, but nobody knew what was right. And kind of out of Scandinavia, right, came this idea that people were hearing about in this country called normalization. And Wolf was one of the clinicians and specialists who traveled to Scandinavia and studied normalization. And it was like a really basic idea. Like the first idea was just that people with mental retardation, it would have been called at the time, ought to be afforded similar rhythms and routines to life that most people have. Like the life of a person with a disability should at least somewhat resemble those of typical valued citizens. Now, most of us would say, well, like, we're not going to argue with that. We would buy that. But you got to remember at the time, like the conditions people were living in, they were like, you know, here's Willowbrook, right? Willowbrook in Staten Island, 5,000 people lived in that place, right? 5,000. And, you know, if you look at the scenes from the day room, this is actually from Philadelphia State Hospital, like you have to go a long way to make change so that those men had life conditions that somewhat resembled those of valued citizens. Like you'd have to make sure that the rooms that people slept in looked somewhat like a bedroom, not cage after cage after cage or crib after crib, sometimes stacked two up, you know? You'd have to make sure that, you know, dinner somewhat resembled a dinner that human beings would have as opposed to feeding time at the zoo, you know, or worse. You know, shower would have to look something like a shower and not, you know, in the room with a drain in the floor and a staff person with a hose, right? So it was radical in the 60s and the 70s, given these conditions. So, I mean, Wolf took these ideas, he made them bigger, he brought them back to the US. These ideas triggered deinstitutionalization. It lit off, you know, everybody was reading the 1972 book on normalization, everybody who was in the field. It was a bestseller at the time of nonfiction, believe it or not. And it helped change things. But Wolf, you know, who was a man who just built and built and built on ideas, you know, he looked at what was happening and he said, you know, things look better. We put partitions in the institutions so that, you know, people were in groupings, sleeping rooms of 3 or 4, and we created smaller dining rooms and we put curtains and we installed real showers and the food was better, you know, I mean, all this, more staff, I mean, all these changes were made, lots of group homes were started. But one of the things Wolf noticed was that, like, this wasn't a difference that was making a difference for people. People still didn't have what he referred to as the good things of life. It still eluded people. It wasn't enough to just have life that resembled typical people. So Wolf, first of all, redefined normalization. And he said, people who are devalued, and he started to expand his thinking. It's not just people with disability need life conditions that are at least as good as those of typical citizens, maybe even better. Now that's still radical today, and you'll learn about that with the conservatism corollary. He then began to study role theory. He was really asking the question, like, how do the good things of life come to any of us, like any of us here in this Zoom room? What are there some good things of life? And he really studied that, and the vehicle that he found that seems to, for most human beings, deliver the good things of life are valued social roles. So that became a real focus point in SRV. And that was a huge change, right? And it also, for those of us who are trying to help people have good lives, for those of us who are trying to, teach, for those of us who are trying to accompany or help elevate our family members, it gives us something really significant to work with. So it's not just normalization renamed, it's significantly different. Now, the definition is a little bit different that I'm going to use with you for teaching purposes. It's a little bit early. It's a 2005 definition, but I really like it for the kind of work we're going to be doing together. You'll see in your book a couple of iterations of later definitions, but I love this. And there's a couple reasons. Like when you look at this for any of you, and just say this or put it in the chat. What do you think is the central idea looking at that definition? Like what are the most important words or concept in that definition? What do you think? See if we can unpack it a little bit. If you had to pick the heart of that message, what is it? Come on. Culturally valued. So Taylor says the idea of culturally valued means, so this is important. I think that is an important concept. Let me come back to that in a minute. But I mean, when I look at this definition, at the heart of it is right here in the middle, valued social roles. And it's the idea that if we want to help people with disability get the good things in life, and we'll talk about what those things are for most of us, we've got to help people figure out valued social roles that would be a good fit for them, that they'd like to fill. We've got to help people get strong in those valued roles, stronger and stronger and stronger. And we've got to help people hang on to the roles that they have because they bring a huge number of benefits into people's lives. Valued social roles appears to be, it's like the gate. With valued social roles, you might get access to the good things of life. Without them, it'll never happen. And so this is particularly true for people who are at value risk, right? For people who are devalued. And Taylor's point, as much as possible, let's try to use the typically valued ways that most of us move into valued social roles, right? I mean, many of you learn to be in the role of student by being in the role of student, you learn over time. It's a gradual acquisition process. And so it's really important not to leap to all the technology. Well, we'll use all these special techniques that we're learning about what works on people with disabilities, and we'll do that. But sometimes those methods and techniques are really helpful, and you'll learn a lot about applied behavior analysis and the TEACH method and all sorts of ways to teach and help people learn and grow. And those things can be really great. And sometimes just really helping people enter valued social roles by the natural ways that all of us do is really important. And sometimes that's the best way. So thanks for bringing that up, Taylor. That is a really important point. The ways that look familiar to most of us. So everybody here knows a lot about valued social roles, right? Because you have lots of them. One role that I think all of you share in this room, or all of you are in the role of university student. right? That's a role that you hold, one of many, many. Can you tell me some of the good things that come to you out of being, what are some of the good things you get out of being a university student that come into your life? You can say or chat. What are some of the good things, the practical good things that come out of being a university student?
For me, I would say just like meeting like tons of different people from all across the country.
Right. So you get lots of opportunities to meet lots of people, some of whom will probably become your friends for life, Olivia, right? I mean, what an opportunity to build friendships, acquaintances, people you never would have met. Absolutely. Alexis, I think Lexi, yeah, says opportunities that you might not normally get, right? So the doorway opens to internships, right? Living situations, jobs on campus. Student, Lexi says student discounts. Absolutely, that's very practical. Freedom, Jenny says. So yeah, that role gives you freedom, you know, in ways that you may never have experienced before, at least before the, before COVID anyway. Yeah, so relationships, meeting new people. It's, Gwen says it's like a pathway to a good job, right? So a pathway to a degree and then a good job. Tina says I get preparation for my future career. You get competencies, right? That you're going to use. The discounts are really a high value for people. Yeah. I bet. And learning to live on your own. So independence. Yeah. Learning to figure out how to do stuff on your own, problem solve, especially if you live on campus. Mackenzie says access to all sorts of new resources you may never had before. So many opportunities on and off campus to gain skills, to join things, to do things, lots of belonging. One thing you haven't mentioned, but I bet you get this, is that you get a certain amount of respect from people because you're at university. Ah, Sierra, oh, you're a university student. Ah, you're a teacher candidate. Oh, I see. It brings some measure of status, doesn't it? I mean, maybe not as much status as you'll have when you're a master teacher, but you see the role has some status. People, when they say, oh, Eden, so tell me, what do you do? And you say, I'm a university student, right? So Eden also says lots of relationships with professors, access to new resources, no doubt. Now, go back for a minute to those people living at Pennhurst and think about them for a minute. If we think about what the good things of life that those people might need, I would say they would be things like acceptance, belonging, friendships, opportunities, personal growth, the chance to be exposed to new things, a decent reputation where people think good things about you, a decent self-image, like I'm a university student. Now, you were able to identify all sorts of really important, what I will call good things of life. And they came to you or are coming to you through one valued role that you hold. Now, it's an important one, right? It might be one of the bigger roles you have in your life right now, but it gives you an insight, doesn't it? Like this is how it works. I'm sorry. If you have valued social roles, you get, at least the chances are, you'll get respect, a decent self-image, a good image in the eyes of other people, opportunities to grow and learn, relationships with lots of different people. It's how it works for human beings. So that's the idea that we want to put to work for people who haven't had that and people who need those good things of life. So that's just one role. And that is a little bit of the, simple beauty, I guess, behind social role valorization. Okay, so there you go, valued social roles. It's about promoting such for people who are at risk. Here's a lovely framework. You might have seen this in something you've read, but it's the simplest and most elegant explanation. In and of themselves, we don't care so much about valued social roles, but we do care in what they make available to people. So our number one goal in the lives of people with disability would be access to the good things of life. We've talked a little bit about those things. The method, the vehicle, the means is through people having lots of valued social roles. And when we're working on valued roles, we work on enhancing the image of the role and also enhancing the person's competence. Right? We don't teach things to people just to teach them. We teach things to people so that they can be in valued social roles. So much more to be said about that beyond today. That is the exciting work if we decide to ally ourselves with people with disability and help to uplift their lives. Now, SRV is not method, right? You're not going to get a checklist on how to do it or an instruction. There's no workbook. Like, it is a foundational way of thinking. But I'll tell you what, the people who have developed, I think, some of the most promising practices ever in disability work are people who study social role valorization. It's like an amazing foundation. And ideas like person-centered planning, which some of you might be familiar with, maybe have used, you will be by the end of your university career. We use it all the time in transition for students from school to work. Well, person-centered planning methods were first developed by people who studied SRV, and some of the best tools and techniques were developed by those early pioneers who were students of Wolf's. You know, the deinstitutionalization and community movement was based on social role valorization and normalization. Supported employment was first pioneered by people who studied Wolf's work. Self-advocacy, you know, the idea that, you know, people can be in the driver's seat of their lives and stand up for themselves as activists, people with lived experience. Self-determination, the idea that people should get to kind of control their resources and choose the kinds of services they need to have a good life. So all kinds of good things have been built on the back of social role valorization. And that's why this course, which is, you know, so much of this course is dedicated to it. I guarantee you, whatever you do, you'll do it better with better outcomes if you have a foundation of SRV. It's just, you know, it's just solid, rock solid. So we are going to be, talking about social devaluation, and that is a hard topic. I'm going to introduce the first 5 wounds to you this morning, and then kind of cut you loose to digest the rest of it over the next week or so. But there are a couple things, like this is a hard presentation. You know, I mean, sometimes it flies in the face of what we want to believe or what other people have told us, or, you know, what even other professors might have told us, what we've experienced within our own families. And that is hard. And as we kind of poke at some of these wounding life experiences, kind of the consequences of devaluation, I just invite you and ask you to hang in there with the ideas. Even when you're feeling like, I just want to like shut down, I don't want to hear this, is that you wait and keep your mind open. And you can pick and choose what you believe, what you want to use, what makes sense to you in the long haul. You really can. And even if some of this worries you, bothers you, kind of gets your hackles up a little bit, makes you feel a little defensive, because every single one of us is implicated in this, right? Because we're all in this society, is that you give it a little chance, keep your mind open, talk it over with people you trust, you know, give it a little bit of time, and you get to choose in the long run what you believe and what you're going to practice. So that's one kind of piece of advice for this, particularly for this presentation. This is the bad news, but it's the bad news that prepares us. It kind of lays out the problem, so then we can think about social role valorization. The second bit of advice I have for you is this idea of, as much as possible, try to take off, you know, your teacher candidate hat, perhaps, certainly your professional hat, you know, maybe even sometimes your family member hat, I'm not sure about that, and try to sort of slip into the shoes of people with lived experience of this kind of social devaluation. And we're asking you to identify with people, even if it's just for the few hours that you watch the wounds presentation and listen to it. And it's hard to walk alongside and see the world through the experience of a person who's been devalued. It's really tough. It's a lot easier to look at it through a clinical lens or a sort of task analysis lens. It's a lot harder to say, wow, you know, if this were me and this were my life, what would I need? What would I want? What would that be like? And we even have a theme in SRV around it, as I think you know, interpersonal identification, the idea of trying to be one with another. And that's a discipline you can teach yourself to do. And it's a good discipline to have. And it is a choice, you know, and I share this quote from Dr. Martin Luther King because he made that so clear. You know, there's a man who chose his words carefully. And he said, I choose to identify with the underprivileged. I choose to identify with the poor. It's a choice. You know, you could decide not to, but we hope that you do. I hope that you do. Okay. So just checking my time here. So as I said, this is a time to lay out some problems. But if we lay out the problem really well, the solution is a lot easier to come by. That's just true. So the first thing I want to do is just explain to you, what do we mean by social devaluation? It's kind of simple. You know, when one person sees another person and judges that person as not quite as good as, not quite as valuable as, maybe not quite worth as much as other people. That person, he's a little less than. So when a person is judged to be of less worth, that's social devaluation. And it happens all the time. Every single one of us do this every day. I mean, human beings are by nature, we are evaluative, right? We see something, we judge it almost immediately. You know, even newborn babies coming into the world immediately have been, you know, researched and proven to be able to discern what's threatening, what's scary, what's not. You know, we're born with that judgment. And the judgment saves our lives over and over again, right? I mean, it's actually quite adaptive in many ways. But that judgment also applies to people, right? People judge people, and they do it all the time. And to think that that shouldn't be or isn't is, you know, isn't that helpful? Because it is, and it happens all the time. Now, you may have heard people who say, I don't judge people, I don't judge. Like, that is not true. We all judge all the time. And in fact, you know, you judged me. You began to judge me the minute that we came into our Zoom room together last week, right? And I the same with you. That's part of being human. That's what we do, right? So it's, you know, it just is. Now that person-to-person devaluation, we don't often worry too much about. I mean, oftentimes it's like because of a particular idiosyncratic reason or another. Like you might devalue people who have a lot of face tattoos. Like you may see somebody with face tattoos and think, oh, those people, that person, I'm not so sure about him. Or maybe you devalue people who wear tons of perfume, you know, because it assaults your senses or makes you sneeze. I don't know. I mean, we devalue people for all, individual people for all sorts of reasons. But there's another level of devaluation that's much more concerning. And that's when a whole group of people in the society looks at a whole nother group and says, those people, they're not as good as, they're less than, they're not as worth as much as. Maybe they're not quite as much a citizen as the rest of us. Maybe they're not even citizens at all. Maybe they're not quite as human as the rest of us humans. Maybe they're not human at all. Oftentimes that's on the basis of a characteristic that's seen to be shared. Maybe it's old age, or maybe it's a particular disability, a mental disorder, or autism, or deep poverty, or immigration status, or ethnic identity, or skin tone, or there may be any number of characteristics. But when that judgment is made against a whole group of people, you can expect that group of people will be poorly treated at the hands of society, and very bad things will come their way. And that's the kind of devaluation that social role valorization tries to ameliorate, you know, both by helping people be judged positively and also helping people with their judgment, you know, so kind of working on both ends. So that's social devaluation. I sort of put up the official definition, right? But it's seeing a group of people or an individual person as having less value than other people. So it's that level. So one thing about devaluation is it does tend to be a universal, right? It seems to be a complete universal. Like there has never been a society that's been discovered either by history or anthropologists or, that doesn't have devaluation. Even in very far removed civilizations and groupings of people, we find devaluation. Now, who gets devalued? Varies from culture to culture and from civilization to civilization. The groups change, but devaluation itself seems to continue. I mean, we even find it among groups of devalued people. I mean, Penhurst was full of devaluation. The working boys who ran the farm devalued and mistreated the people who were seen as the custodial care cases, I mean, lots of layers of devaluation. And, why is there so much of it? Well, I guess that's something for us to think about. I mean, one thing people have said is that, within each of us, there's a great deal of capacity to think good thoughts, to do good things, to treat people really well, to really be good and do good. But there is also great capacity in every single one of us to think mean thoughts and to do mean things, to act on those mean thoughts. Right? We know that. The question is, which group of devalued people do we think ought to have the bad things of life come their way? And all of us have our groups. We'll spend some time, our next class, doing a little exercise around that. And one thing it means for all of you is that if you've decided to walk with devalued people, you're going to bump up against this all the time. Right? You're going to bump up against it. And many of us have thrown up our hands and walked away. But if you're fortified in understanding kind of what happens to people when they get devalued and how can we flip the script, you'll be ready for it. You'll be the best advocate for people. Another thing about devaluation is it's largely unconscious. Like most of us are very unaware, and there's tons of research around that, implicit bias. Most of us are very unaware of our devaluations that we hold. And coming to grips with that is important. But what we want to do for the rest of our class tonight, or most of it anyway, is to spend a bit of time looking at devaluation in a more personal way. How does it impact individual people? And we call those impacts, we call them wounds. And that's it's such a vivid term, it's such an apt metaphor. And the wounds of devaluation. So let's kind of work our way through this a little bit at a time tonight and kind of get you set up for the rest of your work. So I'm going to just skip through some of this. So this is the first of the wounds handouts. There will be 2 of them. There are actually 20 wounds that we'll be covering over the next couple of sessions. But for today, I just want to talk through the first 5, and they'll be very familiar to you. Like it's consciousness raising to see it, but you'll be aware of these things, at least in some way. And these are wounds that once one happens, the rest start to flow in a way that's incredibly organized, oftentimes almost in this sequence. And if we can get a handle on the wounding process, oftentimes we can interrupt it. We can jump in front, and we'll talk about that in some of the themes of SRV. But I mean, the first thing to say is, a physical impairment may or may not be a wound, right? Lots of people with physical disabilities that don't go on to experience lots of devaluation. Oftentimes, however, a physical impairment may lead to a functional impairment, and this causes people to be thrust into a low social status. And one of the first things, once this happens, that tends to happen to people is whatever the characteristic for which they're devalued, whether it's old age or dementia or an intellectual disability or autism or schizophrenia, whatever the reason is, the characteristic, that begins in the eyes of other people to take over the person's identity. And the person virtually gets seen as like Down syndrome themselves. It takes over everything about them, and people see them as the disability. They come to represent it. And I'll tell you, when this happens to people, it is really dangerous. And I'll tell you a little bit why. I mean, sometimes people get actually referred to by their impairment. Have you ever had this happen? You ever heard this? Like people will refer, oh, they're Down syndrome. I mean, I've walked into classrooms in schools and not very long ago and been introduced to people by their disabilities. CP in this class and their autism and she's Downs. You know when someone calls somebody by their disability label, this process has gone pretty far. They are seeing that person as an impairment. And I've had teachers say to me, so I've got 3 behaviors in my class. Now, what are they talking about? What do they mean by that? What do they mean by that? I've got 3 behaviors. Any ideas?
Just like good, bad, and
it's code. Yeah, it's code for challenging behavior. I've got 3 kids with bad behavior. They have behavior problems. That's code for that. Now imagine if your teacher even saw you as a behavior instead of a 4th grade student. It would shape a lot, right? Imagine the mindsets. So I've also heard teachers say, I have 20 IEPs in this class. I mean, a student is not an IEP, they're a student, right? But once you start to see the impairment just become who the person is, it means bad things. So a dear friend of mine has a daughter who's now 26, Mary Elizabeth. She has Down syndrome. Now, when you meet Mary Elizabeth, you immediately know she has a disability, right? It's really evident. That's not the problem. The problem is that people immediately, and professionals were the worst, we start to have all sorts of ideas about Mary Elizabeth, right? All sorts of ideas about where she can go, where she can't go, places that are open to her, what her educational experience should look like, what her work life should look like. Like people might run through this in their heads. So she has Down syndrome. That means she went through special education, probably in a life skills class, probably segregated and congregated. Those people usually are. Now she went to school till she was 21 because that's how long those people go to school. But then probably her parents are old because those people have old parents. Old parents. So they probably have her on the list for a group home. She'll get into the group home in the next few years and she'll live there. Now, after school, she probably goes to either a day program or maybe a sheltered workshop, but probably Down syndrome, it's a day program. Now, about the age of 42, she'll start to get Alzheimer's because that's what happened to those people. She'll probably end up in a nursing home and she'll be dead by the time she's 58 because that's how long those people live. Now, what just happened to Mary Elizabeth's life like that? That's a look at her face. Like her world went like this. It got really small. And the same is true for lots of young people coming through our educational system who are labeled. And not my, I have a 26-year-old son without obvious disability. When people meet Stephen or see his face, they think, oh, I wonder what's going to happen with your son. Like, is he going to travel? Is he going to go back to school? Who's he going to fall in love with? Is he going to run for office? The world's wide open for Stephen, but not for Mary Elizabeth. We've got her in her grave in 5 minutes of seeing her face, right? It's a railroad track. And human services provides a heck of a railroad track, and oftentimes it's a small life and a very limited life. So that's what it means to have your identity reduced to an impairment. And that's what happens to lots of people with disability, lots of them. So the next wound that's likely to come people's way is a toughie. Sorry, I'm having all sorts of interesting I've redone my equipment tonight. It's not working well for me. The next wound that's likely to come people's way is rejection. Now, all of you have experienced rejection. It's part of being human. I would say to you that the kind of rejection that's experienced by devalued people is oftentimes much more profound. It oftentimes starts at birth, extends through life, and it is a continuous message of you don't fit, you don't belong, we don't need you, we don't want you, we kind of wish you weren't here. And that message gets sent sometimes early on. I mean, I know parents who, gave birth to a child with disability, and instead of getting welcome baby cards from people, they got sympathy cards. I'm sorry about your child, right? That's rejection. And the rejection comes from all sides. You know, it comes from the society that says, you know what, we can do without you. There's nursing homes all over the place. Why don't you just move out of your community, out of your neighborhood, out of your home and go over there because that's where you belong. That's rejection. Pennhurst was profound rejection on a societal level. People get rejected by schools all the time. You know, oh, your brother and sister were welcome at this wonderful neighborhood school, but not you. You can go over here. We've got a special place. That's rejection. You know, rejection from families, right? That's some of the most painful rejections human beings can experience. And even rejection by human services that say they're there to accept people, they reject people all the time. Kick people out, shuffle people around, parents going from pillar to post trying to find a program that'll take their child. Rejection is intense. And just a couple of examples. You know, I think of a personal care home with a beautiful mission statement. It's actually located not far from where all of you are today. Big fancy mission statement about how they're there to help people have really full lives and things. There was a man who died in a room there, and his body was not discovered for 4 days. And it was only discovered because the heat came on and he began to decompose. Now, that is rejection. When no one notices that you're gone from the world for 4 days. Like, that is a form of profound rejection. And rejection is a hinge wound, folks. Like we call it a hinge wound because once it happens, it unleashes all sorts of other forms of rejection. And one form of rejection is this next wound. So one way that rejection gets expressed is by making sure that the roles, right? We've been talking a lot about roles, that the roles that are available for devalued people, instead of being roles like university student, good neighbor, elder brother, baseball team member, I don't know, all sorts of roles, people get sluiced into really harmful, negative roles. They get channeled right into them, and those roles capture them. And then instead of having valued social roles, they get a pocket full of harmful, devalued roles that really cause people to turn against them and reject them even more. These roles go back in time, over and over again. You'll be very familiar. All you really have to ask yourself is, what are the negative stereotypes about disability? So let me ask you that question. What are the negative stereotypes that are kind of floating around in society? People say those people with disability are. Just shout them out.
Incompetent.
Incompetent, they can't do anything, they can't learn anything. What else?
Helpless.
Helpless, innocent, just need help with everything. They can't do anything. They require a lot of caregiving. Problematic, that's right, they're problems. Gwen says slow, they're very slow, those people, yep. And maybe worse ones, So you got it, you know some of them. Dependent, right? Stupid, less than, yeah. Dirty, uncontrolled. They melt down all the time, right? Whoops, sorry, I'm flipping through now. Okay, you got it. So let me go through some of these historic deviancy roles. They'll echo the things you just said, but I'll go into them a little bit deeper. So the first role, and probably the most devastating role that people with disability tend to get thrust in, is being seen as not fully human, maybe not yet human, right? You kind of have to earn personhood. Or maybe they were human, as with maybe our elders, but we'll say, well, she's not really my mother anymore. Or my grandmom's not really there. It's just a shell of her former self, no longer human. Or people get seen as subhuman, maybe more like an animal than a human being, right? Maybe more like a vegetable. We even have some diagnostic labels that kind of cement that negative role. Or maybe more like an object to be moved from place to place and so forth. Or maybe they're just so weird, they're like other, they're not human and they're not even from this planet. So just a couple of examples. So here's, So this is old stuff, right? This is probably 40 years old. Joseph Fletcher is a very famous sociologist, and he came up with these indicators of personhood. He said there were 15 of them, and that if an organism was to be considered human, that organism had to have, for example, an IQ above 40. If it was below 40, it was questionable, but below 20, you're not a person at all, right? Self-control, a sense of the time, a sense of the future, changeability, not being opposed to change, like that you have to earn personhood. But I'll tell you, this is old stuff, and you might say things have changed, but we have Peter Singer today and many other utilitarian thinkers who hold that human life only has value if it produces for the society. And he said, he's advocated for parents and doctors having the right to up to 4 years of age, making a decision that a child will not be productive and actually killing that child. Right? He's out on the circuit. He has lots to say these days about who ought to be in line for COVID treatment. And guess what? People with disability aren't on his list. Right? So this idea that personhood has to be earned, or practices like keeping people in cages, or like we have in Massachusetts, using shock collars and cattle prods, and now, fancy desanitized backpacks with electric shocks that are administered, right? Those are all kind of animal control tactics. Or you guys are all too young to remember this, but many of these cases go on every day and we just don't hear about them. This one we did. Terry Schiavo was a woman who had a serious brain injury. Her husband, she used a feeding tube for nutrition, and also for water as well. And her husband decided that she really wasn't human, that she was a vegetable. He coincidentally wanted to get remarried, so he advocated to get her feeding tube pulled out and for her to die of death by starvation and dehydration. Now, this made all the press, it was an international case. And no matter what people felt about Terry Schiavo and what ought to happen with her, one thing we heard over and over again was like, she's a vegetable. She's a vegetable. She's in a persistent vegetative state. She's nothing but a vegetable. This is an image, by the way, of Terry and her priest looking not like a vegetable. And just think about the power of, like, it's just a lot easier to say, yeah, why not? I mean, if she's like a vegetable, I can't relate to that. Pull the tube out. So, and people with autism, people with serious mental health disorders, oftentimes, get referred to using outer space, terms like books of mice and aliens, or Through the Eyes of Aliens, a book about autistic people, or referring to the universe of autism. That happens all the time, as if people with autism don't share the same universe as, typical people. So, these non-human roles kind of pave the way for bad things to happen to people. And the role of objects is another interesting one. If we had more time, I'd talk a little more, but this idea of people just being a sort of object to be moved, to be placed, to be wheeled in and wheeled out. And one of my colleagues here in India that I do a lot of teaching with, he rides a wheelchair. And one of the things that happens to him all the time is people come up behind him and they move his wheelchair without asking him. Like, they just move it like he's an object. It happens in restaurants, it happens in hotels, it happens everywhere we go. So, it's just a small example of referring to the people you serve as my people, like they're owned by you. People aren't owned by their services, right? They're owned by themselves. So that's one negative role. Another one is the role of being seen as a menace. This is a really dangerous role, right? Like you talked about with Pennhurst, once people get menacized, we'll do anything. It's like fight or flight, right? We'll do anything. So just some examples on the left. This is Brandon. So his situation came to light. I was actually teaching this workshop in Holland in one of their state-of-the-art, fancy, doesn't look anything like Pennhurst at all institutions, of which they have many. Brandon at 18 years old had been tied to a wall for 3 years. 3 years. And of course, the justification was he's so dangerous. And the image you see on the right, so that is from a classroom here in Pennsylvania. We have all sorts of segregated schools that have so many timeout rooms, bullpens, padded rooms to throw people in, to put people in. We detoxify them. I'll talk a lot about that. But I mean, we'll do anything to people we see as dangerous. We'll drug them up, and we do, with handfuls of medication, right? We'll restrain them. We'll put them in timeout. We'll put them in prison, as we've done horribly to people with mental health disorders. You know, it's our number one mental health treatment facility these days are our prisons. 80% of people in prison have a mental health diagnosis at this point. So, you know, it's serious business, this idea of making people out to be dangerous or putting people in the role of being a menace. Or how about this? People in the role of being seen as trash, as being just not worth it. Like, who cares what happens to people? And lots of examples of this. You know, we do a little study of the places we find special education classrooms, even now, you know, under the steps, in the storage room. Here's an example, you know, in the class that's decorated mostly with a giant trash can, or in the old girls' locker room that's good enough for those students, or you're even creating a student's workspace in a washroom, in a bathroom, right? Now, my daughter, they'd never say, let's have her study in the washroom, in the bathroom, or in the old girls' locker room. It would never happen. In the storage room. But these kids, it's trashing people. Or here's an old role, the role of object of ridicule. This role goes back hundreds of years. So in medieval times, you would have seen jesters in the court. Oftentimes they were people with disability or mental health disorders of some sort, people whose job it was to sort of tell jokes, to be silly, to do stupid things, and to make people laugh at their expense. Alive and well. People with disability get asked to perform, to sing their little songs, to do that funny impersonation they do. Oh, come on, show us. I was helping visiting a woman actually who'd left a death house institution in Romania. She was in her 50s, and I was being brought to her new home to meet her. And when they introduced me, they said, oh, Mariana, this is Betsy. She came all the way from the United States to see you. Mariana, do your penguin dance. Come on. Do it. Oh, you should see her do this dance. She's so cute. Mariana, do your penguin dance. I mean, the woman finally got up and sort of hopped across the floor, you know? I mean, it was just devastating. You think about that role of being here to make us giggle and laugh at how silly they are, and just not taking people's lives and time very seriously. Like people's purposes to entertain us. Or object of pity, right? This is a role that lots of devalued people get sluiced into, right? That, oh, those poor pathetic people, they can't do anything. You mentioned it in the chat, you know, they're just sad. And gosh, I mean, when people say to you, for those of you who are planning to be special educators, I mean, what do people say to you when you say you want to do that? You must be so, fill in the word, lazy. Oh wait, I think brave, yeah, and special, patient. You must be really patient to work with those people, because I know. So absolutely, right? And when you feel ick when people say that to you, you feel ick because you're getting pitied by extension. They pity people with disability, and they pity you by extension. And the problem with this role is it raises a lot of money. It does. So all sorts of fundraising appeals, I mean, just an example here, are based on us purposefully portraying people with disability as being pathetic, needy, sad, give a little, and imaging people in this role. Like, it might raise a lot of money, but it's not free money. It's money that's raised on the backs and the reputation of people with disability. I mean, you look at what happened to Jerry Lewis telethons. It's been over for a few years now. You might not even remember it, but used to parade people with muscular dystrophy out on the stage, and you had poster children, and you talk with some of those poster children now as adults and what that did to them. Made a professional career out of being an object of pity. Or here's another role, being seen as a burden, kind of a social, emotional, financial drain. That's sort of like, okay, we got this IDEA, we've got this law, we know you need some things, we're going to give you a roof over your head, we're going to give you 3 meals a day, because we're good people, we're a good society, and we have lots of benefactors, we're wealthy, we can afford to do this. And guess what? You should be grateful. You should say thank you. You should take what we give you. You better not ask for anything more. You better not ask for anything different. That's the hidden message. Because all these good people are investing, all these teachers and all these benefactors. And don't you know there's 300 people on the waiting list for your group home if you don't like it? You don't like your sheltered workshop? You know how many people would fill your spot today? Families, you're not happy with your services, take your daughter home. That's the underlying trouble with this role. And as was said, people just being seen as needy and dependent. It's just not likely people are going to have access to a really good life, a full life, if this is the role that they're stuck in. And just, I mean, this is a huge issue in the places I work, but also in the US as well, when these reminders around us of all the donors, you know, who are giving their good money so that you have what you have, and just reminding people over and over again, like, you're a burden, you know, but for the grace of all these good people, you're a burden. It's subtle, but it's there. Or this is the side of a Goodwill truck, like, thank you. Better be grateful. Or here's a famous role. This is a role after 40 years. We're still teaching this. It's still a predominant role for people with disability, the role of the eternal child who will never grow up, frozen forever, right? You'll combat this in your classrooms. You know about this. People get treated like children. They get talked to as though they're children. Their physical environments are decorated with childish things. They're given childish things to do. They're given a childish personal appearance and so forth, just self-fulfilling prophecy. This is a transition classroom. It's for students 18 to 21 who are leaving the school system and transitioning into work. And this is how that classroom is decorated. It couldn't be any more clear, right? Or just patronizing, right? You know, patting people on the head, you know, in the same kind of way of being paternalistic towards people. Or elders in their second childhood. This is a pretty negative role for people who have lived full lives and propped up our country and built our economy to end up snuggling with teddy bears. Or here's a funny role. It's the role of the holy innocent. This is also a role that goes back in time, and it does offer some protection for people. It's sort of like people are seen as innocent, blameless, not knowing right from wrong, kind of incapable of making decisions. They need a lot of shelter. Oftentimes it's families who are terrified of the other negative roles who sort of take this on. We can completely understand it. The problem with the role is that people tend to be powerfully over-controlled. You know, they get told what to do, when to do it, and they're shielded from taking the kinds of risks that help us grow as people. I mean, you know yourself, when you step out and take a little bit of a risk, that's oftentimes when your developmental growth just goes, you know, and oftentimes people who are in this role just don't get that opportunity to take normative risks, you know, to learn and to grow. So that sheltering is, you know, one of the impacts of this role. Or the human service client. This is a role that's fairly new on the scene. We didn't talk about this probably 20 years ago, but in this role, people are seen as clients of a service system owned by the system, you know, with lots of records being taken, lots of sort of services being rendered to the person and being billed, oftentimes highly commodified. There's lots of people earning per diems off the services this person is getting. So it becomes kind of a services mill. It's typically accompanied by lots of paperwork. This was one parent's effort to capture the volumes of paperwork in her child's IEP throughout his developmental years. And you know, lots of kind of clienthood imagery surrounds people. This is a quality assurance mechanism that gets put actually in group homes that lets the staff just push a button. Current compliance, 98%. Total behaviors in the last 24 hours. There's that word again. When the word behavior is used, that's the language of clienthood. When the word compliance is used, this is all about people management, right? Compliance is a code word. So the human service client role is a biggie, and many of us are pretty fully invested in it. Sometimes our biggest role alongside people is just trying to liberate people from 24/7 clienthood, one service to another. Another role is people being seen as sick. It's okay to be in the sick role if you're sick, but if you're not sick, it's not okay, right? It's not good. People say rest, don't work too hard, don't push yourself, and aren't likely to be pushed. The thing we tend to see with people who are cast in the sick role is that there's just all like normal life activities get turned into kind of a medicalized procedure like Lego therapy. Right? That is a normal, typical activity for lots of young people and old people as well. But here we make it a therapy. There's a therapy for everything. Clown therapy, right? Pet therapy, all sorts of pet therapy. Piano therapy, music therapy, dance therapy. You're not likely to get horseback riding lessons, but you can for sure get therapeutic riding and for free, right? So when everything's a therapy in your life, you can bet you're probably in the sick role. And the last role that I want to cover tonight, we're out of time, is the role of people being seen as dying, as good as dead, or as better off dead. And this is that quiet voice that is sometimes in the back of people's minds. Maybe they're not even aware of it, that meets a person with a significant disability. And the thought goes through your head, would it be better if? Would it be better for the family if? Would it be better for society if? Would it be better for that person if they weren't here? If they'd never been born? If this bout of pneumonia was the one that finally took them? And imagine if it was your physician who had that tape running in the back of his mind. And so there's been lots of study and work about the hastening of death of devalued people. All you need to do is look at the protocols for COVID treatment and how many people with just simple physical disabilities are being turned away from treatment, put on a do not ventilate. That's death making. That's the role of people being seen as better off dead. And the longer you hang out with people with disability, the longer this role becomes clear to you. So these are the 11 roles that people tend to get stuck in. One of the things we're really going to talk about in social role valorization is trying to flip the script and help liberate people from these roles. And there are things that work to liberate people from these negative roles, and there are things that don't work. And what doesn't work is just saying, that's not good, I don't like it, I'm mad about it, this shouldn't be. What liberates people from devalued roles is understanding how roles work. So we'll have lots to talk about that. Okay, so much more to come. I'm sorry, I know it's depressing, I know it's hard, but it's such important information for you to be aware of. It's so important. So we have 2 more presentations just walking us through the wound. Negative roles is just one. I think you'll find them interesting. This was sort of the longest chunk, but I am going to ask you over the next week to go in your D2L content. You'll see the next 2. I think it says part 1 and 2, but it's actually part 2 and 3. Just to watch them, to finish out the roles presentation, and we'll dig into it that class after to really do some discussion, some exercises together to see if we can't get a handle on this stuff together and digest it. So for next class coming up real soon, we're basically going to be getting a presentation by library science folks about how to do research. I think that will help. It won't take the whole class time. So I'll reserve, I think, the final time to talk about APA, to talk about your first papers. Don't sweat the first papers. If you're freaking out about APA, if you're freaking out about citations, don't. It's okay. You're welcome to set up a time in the meantime to talk with me about it if you are freaking out. But if not, let's talk about it next class at the end. And yeah, I think that's it. All right, sorry, I rambled on there a little bit. I know it's like a few minutes late. I'm sorry. All right, how are you? Okay. Esther's like, I'm not sure. I'm kind of in the middle. It's a bummer, I know. But good food for thought for you. Good food for thought for all of us. So take this with you. Send me a mail if you need anything at all. Office hours are Friday at 8 a.m. And I'll see you on Thursday. Okay, thanks
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Hey, hi Jenny.
You're still recording the session.
Let me stop that. Thank you for noticing.